Hi, in today's topic, we'll be studying about communication. What is communication? What is the process of communication? What are the elements of communication, nature and characteristics of communication? So to begin with, communication is transferring information from one part of the business to another that leads to some outcome, change behavior or any changed practices. It's not only business from one person to another or from a group of people to another group of people, which leads to some outcome, some change behavior, or any change practice. It is the art of transmitting information, ideas, and attitude from one person to another. It is the process of meaningful interaction among human beings. When we talk about the exact meaning or the essence of communication, what usually is, it occurs between two people. Communication usually occurs between two people, or it can be more. Then it's a personal process. It involves people, it involves human beings. It always involves change in behavior. That is, it always has an outcome. It is never meaningless, it is always meaningful. Then it means to influence other. It is an expression of our thoughts, of our feelings. It is an emotion which is being carried through words and actions. It is a tool for controlling and motivating people. It is a social and emotional process. So, overall, if we talk about communication, it is a process where we transfer information from one person to another, from a group of people to another, from an organization to another, and it always has a purpose, whether to inform, whether to educate, entertain, persuade, motivate, or any changed behavior. Now, let us look at the communication process. There are two persons involved, sender and receiver, or rather, I can say two parties involved, sender and receiver. Sender is a person who initiates the message, initiates the process, and receiver is the person who where the process actually ends, where the entire communication lands. So, two people, sender and receiver. Then there comes a medium, that is how we are communicating, whether orally or whether through written communication or a non-verbal communication. Then always once the receiver receives the feedback message, he always gives his feedback or response back to the sender, and this feedback actually completes the process of communication. So this process is being started by the sender. Then sender encodes the message. He uses a medium to communicate it to the receiver. Receiver decodes the message and then gives us feedback to the sender. And this process is usually disturbed by a barrier or a noise. While I am taking this lecture, you must have heard a class bell in the background, so that's also a kind of a noise. But yes, it actually much did not much disturbed the lecture, but yes, there may be much barriers in the process of communication that we'll discuss in my later videos. Now, what are the most common ways to communicate? Spoken words, written words that we commonly see. Then comes the visual images. That are the images that we see in newspaper, in television, maybe on social media, in books. Then comes the body language, the way we communicate, the way we present ourselves, the way we speak, like the tone of the voice. If we are happy, our voice is becomes loud. If we are sad, the voice becomes gloomy. So these are all the ways of communication. Whatever we are feeling is always communicated with the words, and along with that through our body language. There are certain other mediums also, like we have letters, memo, reports, notice boards, faxes, telephone, email, face-to-face communication, body language, video conferencing, internet, right? So this was the basis that I have studied, this was the basis that we have just gone through. What is communication, what are the essence, a simple process of communication, and what are the common ways through which we communicate. Now let us look at the process, the actual process of communication. Here is a source known as sender. He has an idea what he wants to communicate, and that idea is encoded into a message, and this message is being communicated through a channel which is known as the medium, and then this is being received by the receiver. He decodes the message and then gives us feedback back to the sender. So it is sender conceives the message, that he understands the message. He encodes the message into an understandable form. Then he selects the appropriate channel. He sends the message. Receivers receive the message. He interprets the message. Then sender receives the feedback from the receiver. Right. Now let us understand the elements of communication. What are the various elements of communication? These elements are nothing. These elements just constitute the process of communication. So source, or we can also call him the sender of the message. Source is the person who initiates the message, who initiates the process of communication. He decides why he wants to communicate, what he wants to communicate, what is the usefulness of the information, and whatever information he or she is sending has to be always accurate information, not the wrong information, as it affects the credibility of the sender. Next comes the encoding. Encoding is the process of transferring the information the sender wants to communicate into a form that can be sent and correctly decoded at the other end. For example, if we take example of this video only, so I have encoded this entire lecture in this video through a PowerPoint presentation. I have encoded this lecture in a video. So this is a form encoding. That is I am giving a form to my message. I have in my mind I want to teach you communication, but how I will teach you communication? Only oral communication will not work. It should take certain shape so that it can reach large number of audience. So that is why I have encoded into a PowerPoint presentation first. That is a visual that you are seeing on your screens, and then I have recorded this PowerPoint presentation into a video format so that you can see it and you can also understand it through my audio. So this is what encoding is, putting it into the understandable form, or putting the message into an understandable form. So it tells the ability of the sender to convey the information. Even like non-verbal messages are sometimes also encoded. Like if you want to send a smile to someone, so like through text messages normally we use various emojis like heart, or maybe a broken heart, or a smile, or maybe a clap, or a sign of namaste. So these are all called as encoding. That is in the modern time we are using that. So it is simply putting your message into an understandable form which a receiver can very well easily understand. Encoding eliminates all the sources of communication. That is, we sometimes mistake certain kind of assumptions, or we sometimes do not interpret the information, or if there is any missing information. So through proper encoding, all these kinds of confusion can be eliminated. And one more thing for encoding is important is knowing your audience. To know your audience is very important, because unless and until we do not know whom we are talking to and whom we want to talk to, we can never encode a message. Like if I know that yes, my audience is a graduate student or an undergraduate student, Hindi and English speaking audience, accordingly I can shape my lecture. But imagine if I would shape this lecture in some regional language, then obviously you won't be able to understand it. So knowing your audience is better. We are in the media industry, and for us target audience are very important, and every media first of all studies their audience, and then they try to encode the message accordingly. Right, even for a teacher it is very important to understand their audience, what are their mental level, what are their language preference, from what education background they are coming, and accordingly they shape their lectures. So this is encoding. Now let us come to the various mediums or channels. There are verbal communication channels, face-to-face meetings, telephones, video conferencing, then written communication channels, letters, emails, memos, reports. There are many we come across daily. There are in numerous examples. You can check yourself about the various mediums of communication. Now let us study what are the factors that are involved in choosing the means of communication. Like what sender sees that before what sender I mean how sender selects the method of communication. The first is the cost. He looks for the cost effective method. Then second is the confidentiality. That is, if he wants to share some secret information, then what is the most confidential method that he looks for. Then an influence. What is the influence of a medium? Obviously, an audio-visual presentation is always more beneficial than an oral communication presentation, or simply written notes. So it has to be a combination of audio-visual, which is more influential. more influence for the audience. So influence is the one factor that one looks for. Then urgency. If it is very urgent, then yes, urgent communication. For urgent communication, we always use oral communication. If it is a distant thing and it is not very urgent, then we look for the written communication. This is my next point only. Then what are the available resources you have, whether you have phone, whether you can send an email or laptop. So it entirely depends on the resources then you have. Then the written records, some messages are being only sent through letters and papers only. Then for that, written record has to be looked for. Then your receiver, that as I in my last slide explained, the target audience, right? Now let us come to the receiver. Receiver is the person for whom the message is meant. He interprets the entire message and he gives his feedback while while receiving the message, right? But before giving the feedback, what receiver does is he decodes the message. Decode is understanding the message. Usually decoding is a psychological process where you try to understand the message, try to understand the meaning of the message. Like I have encoded this PPT, this presentation here, and while you are listening to it or while you are watching it, the understanding is there happening in your mind is decoding. You are trying to understand that what exactly the meaning of this particular message is, and how you can do actual decoding. You have to listen actively, you have to read information very carefully, and you need to avoid any confusion. And for a better understanding, you can always ask questions from your sender. So if you want clarity on any point, then decoding would happen at the best level. If you make assume things, then obviously decoding cannot happen properly. So it's better if there is any confusion, one you can ask questions always from the sender. Then the last element, that is feedback. Feedback is the response of the receiver that reaches back to the sender, and without this, the communication process is incomplete, because feedback tells the sender whether the message has been received or not, one thing. Secondly, whether it has been correctly received or not, and received or not. And third thing is that whether it has been correctly interpreted by the receiver or not. So for that, feedback is important. If it is a positive feedback that yes, everything was on place on time, then sender can proceed further, and if not, then he or she can make the necessary changes. Then comes feedback can be your verbal reaction, that is your oral reaction, and then your non-verbal reactions. It can be a positive feedback and it can be a negative feedback. Now let us look for tips for successful communication, that how you can have a successful communication. Read the information carefully so that there are no misassumptions, there are no assumptions, they are not mistaken information, and there is no incomplete information. There should be no lack of clarity. Read. Listen intelligently. Always listen carefully whatever your sender is saying, because if you are at a receiver at this point, maybe next time you are the sender, right? So you should be listen intelligently, showing an interest into the sender's messages. Think and plan. Always think and plan before sending anything. If you are a sender, always think and plan in advance whatever you have to say, whatever you have to write. Always use appropriate language, simple language, no slangs, no sophisticated or bombastic words. Use simple and appropriate language which is easy to understand and which is easy to speak also. Always be open-minded whenever you are speaking, because you will meet a lot of people from different perception, and one has to understand their viewpoint also. One has to understand that one may understand your message very quickly, the other person may not understand your message very quickly. So you have to be very open-minded, and if there is any need for repetition of the message, you can always do. Always select the best media. How you choose, I have explained. The timing of your message, it should not be very lengthy. Then always get the feedback from your receivers. It helps you to always improvise. One cannot be perfect. Loopholes, gaps are always there. It is the responsibility of the sender to minimize the gap, and to minimize the gap, what you need to do is to obtain the feedback and always aim higher at the bigger things, right? So now let us talk about the nature of communication. Communication is an art as well as a science. Why it is an art? It is a way of doing things. Art is always that how we are doing the thing. So communication is an art. It is how you are able to interpret your information, how you are able to encode the information in an understandable form. That is why it is an art. And why it is a science? Science is something which is based on scientific principles and knowledge, and communication is based on certain theories, certain principles and models that we'll be studying in our later units. So it's an art, that how you are communicating, and it is a science based on certain facts and principles. It's an inborn urge. Inborn urge, like we have an inborn urge of, like, we feel hungry, we feel thirsty, we feel like crying, like we breathe. So communication is also an inborn urge. Imagine a person who is deaf and dumb, not able to speak, not able to hear. So still he or she wants to communicate through the sign language, because it's an inborn urge. One cannot be quiet and live in isolation throughout their life. So it's a kind of an inborn urge in every human being. It's a human process. It involves human beings. It involves human beings that are living in the society. It connects the society. It connects the people from different countries, different religion, different areas. Imagine, I would rather say, let us look at a smaller circle, even in your family, in your friends group, office, anywhere you need communication. So that is why it is a social process, and it is applicable everywhere. All the methods of communication, all the principles of communication are applicable everywhere. So it is a universal process. Now, characteristics of communication. It is a means to convey a meaning. Communication is always meaningful, it is never meaningless. So it is a means to convey meaning. I have some thought in my mind, how would I communicate to you? And what is the purpose of my communication? Whatever I'm saying, it always a means to convey meaning. That is, it's a way to convey something meaningful. It is always a two-way process. It is not a one-way process, as we started in the process of communication. It is a continuous process. It is an ongoing process. It is a never-ending process. It starts from the birth of a person, it ends with his death. Then it's a managerial function. Every organization, every business unit requires effective communication in their organization so that it can function properly. So it is a managerial function. Thank you for today's lecture. Here I would like to end my lecture. In my next lecture, I'll be talking about the other units of this particular course, of this particular subject.